I'm Chris Luzniak,
And I'm Rob Byer,
and this is the Debate Math Podcast,
the show where we redefine what it means to debate in mathematics and education.
where multiple sides of ideas are explored, evidence matters, and we all grow and learn from hearing each other.
Because the world and our classrooms are not binary.
So let's dig into this month's debate.
Today's hot seat takes on a topic that challenges what some of us often do. We're wondering if maybe we are a little too trusting when it comes to brain-based research.
You've probably heard it before, claims about how the brain learns best or teaching moves justified by neuroscience. These ideas have shaped classrooms and professional development and even policy. But here's the question. Have we gone too far?
So in this hot seat, we're joined by two unrelated guests who are going to team up to argue that math education over-relies on brain-based research, and that this reliance may actually be limiting how we think about teaching, learning, and students themselves.
So let's dive into the debate with this resolution. Math education over relies on brain research.
So, first up in our hot seat is an educator and the founding director of the Lyric Institute, an independent research organization focused on the philosophy of learning and relational pedagogy. This guest holds master's degrees in both education and divinity, with advanced study in instructional leadership from Harvard and the University of Michigan. Her academic work centers on infielded cognition, a framework arguing that learning is fundamentally a field phenomenon arising in the relational space between teacher, student, and world. And she is currently completing a philosophical monograph on what it means to teach and learn in a relational age. We'll have to hear more about that later, but it's Reverend Jessica Solomon. Hello, Jessica.
Hi, thanks for having me today.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast. And can you tell our listeners where you are and more about yourself and your current role?
Yeah, I am right outside of Boston. I work at the Rashi School as a fifth grade teacher and also as the innovation educator.
Okay. And then the question we ask all of our guests, when did math first become controversial to you?
Yeah, as I was saying to you guys before, I think that my first moment of true controversy with math was when I was a struggling math student. In the elementary grades, I just remember the humiliation and shame of the classroom, of the math classroom for me, of feeling like I didn't understand what was happening, that I didn't understand why I needed to do it. So really, I guess, a crisis of meaning, and the meaning of math and why it was important.
Okay, awesome. Well, wonderful. Thank you for joining us.
And arguing along with her, we have a mathematician and former rock musician who began his education career by teaching at a private all-girls school in rural England and later in Los Angeles at LAUSD. Leaving the classroom in 2006, he became a math specialist for the Los Angeles Unified School District, where he designed many of the district's algebra and geometry concept tasks and did wide-ranging professional development to drive classroom implementation. A passionate believer in the power of all students to learn mathematics conceptually, he joined the nonprofit Mind Research Institute team as a senior mathematics specialist in spring of 2010, eventually becoming the vice president of content creation. It's Nigel Nesbitt. Nigel, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you guys for having me here. And hi, Jessica. Lovely to be here and very excited to get stuck in. So, yes.
And can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
I am still in Los Angeles and I am still, notice the Los Angeles, my accent is still going strong. 26 years here, but still hopefully got some kind of an accent. And I am still vice president of content creation at Mind Education. So still building games, building learning objects, and doing all that kind of
Uh,
stuff. So,
when did math first become controversial to you?
yeah, interesting. I mean, for me, I think my experience as a student was a little different. I loved math growing up, absolutely all the way through. And for me, one of the first moments where I kind of felt like, not like I hit a roadblock, but something connected with math just didn't feel right, actually was when I was teaching. And I was observing other teachers at the time in the school where I taught. And some I thought were fantastic. and others who were teaching, AP calculus and a lot of classes of this nature. I remember one going to visit a classroom very vividly. I'd probably been teaching there a couple of weeks, and you're going to observe other teachers. And there was a guy who was teaching in September who had a list of all his homework assignments for the year written on the board. So I know on April the 15th, I am giving this homework assignment, right? And at that point, I just thought, ooh, something about this is not right, right? This is just, and yet there was, it wasn't that the expectation was that everybody would do that, but this was definitely being held up as a model of like, well, great, this is, good teaching here. This guy's really got it together and kind of, and that there was a part of me that went, wow, this guy's really got it together. But it didn't take long to realize that, yeah, that's not the kind of teacher that I wanted to be. And that was not how I was in my classroom. And, that caused challenges at times where you're sort of pushing against that kind of, well, here's the standards, here's the thing, here's this. And I'm like, no, this isn't math. This is awful. But so there was definitely for me and continues to be a challenge between this rigidity, I guess, of thought in terms of what math is, how we should teach it, and the actual reality of what math learning looks like and feels like, and so forth and so on. So I think that's where some of my controversy kind of lies.
Man, Nigel, we could almost have a whole episode just on that, but thank you and welcome to the podcast.
Yes, and with that, let's get into this debate. All right, so we begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. Although they are on the same side, we want to give them each a chance to share their thoughts. You each have about 2 minutes to present your arguments, and we're starting here with Jessica, arguing that math education over relies on brain research. So
Yeah.
Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah. So, I actually think that there's a question underneath that question that we're debating, which is really not how much should math education rely on brain-based research, but something more fundamental, which is what kind of thing is learning. And I'm coming to that because I feel like how we answer that question determines everything downstream, right? Which researchers get consulted, which findings count as evidence, and what teachers are trained to notice. And if decision makers have decided, even implicitly, that learning is primarily a neurological event, then of course, neuroscience becomes the governing framework because it's the right tool for the job that people think that they're doing. But I'm thinking that that answer is wrong at the center because we're not teaching students as brains in our classrooms. We're teaching students as minds, right? And a brain and a mind aren't the same thing. So the brain's biological and bounded and measurable, and neuroscience tends to the brain, and that matters. But the mind is what happens when the current is running through. It's relational and emergent, and it doesn't sit neatly inside of the skull. So I'm thinking about my students, and you can have a neurologically intact and cognitively capable student who's decided based on years of experience that mathematics isn't a place where they belong. Their brain's fine, but nothing's happening because the current isn't running. And cognitive science has known this for decades, that the mind is embodied and extended, it's embedded, and it's inactive, which means basically that it lives in our bodies, our tools, our cultures, and our interactions with others. In the work that I do, I introduce this idea of the mind being infielded because I think that the relational field between a teacher and a student is where a child either learns that their mind belongs in mathematics or doesn't. And the field isn't in a brain, it's in what I call the between, which is where the most important mathematical learning either happens or doesn't. So I'm not here to argue for less science, but maybe for better science and for a math education that allows not just how does the brain learn, but whose mind gets to belong here.
Thank you. And now we will hear from Nigel. Nigel, you
All
also
right.
have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Please stop me if I ramble and go for too long because Jessica's was perfectly, beautifully wrapped up there and fantastic. So I'm gonna agree with a lot of what Jessica said, but I am gonna sort of push on a couple of interesting points. But I really like this point. It's not necessarily a question of less science, it's the right science. We have a horrible history in education of implementing what I would almost call pseudoscience. And we've done this for years with this sort of learning styles, right brain, left brain, none of which is real, none of which is actual neuroscience, none of which has any validity whatsoever. And yet, certainly when I was teaching in LAUSD back in the day, the notion that learning styles was not absolutely 100% a thing would be like sort of heresy. Basically, it was a a perspective that was just like, oh my gosh, you can't say that. And I'm like, no, this is just not true. And one of the challenges, and Jessica, I was reading your article, which I really liked and enjoyed a lot, and you're talking about, a lot of this sort of implementing brain-based ideas in the classroom. One of the problems, if I was to write an article and say, call it spatial temporal reasoning and how it underpins mathematical learning, I would probably get 3 clicks, right? But if I wrote an article and called it three neuro tricks or 3 neuro tips for your math classroom, oh my gosh, there'd be a bazillion clicks the next day, right? And we have a tendency, and I think this is really one of the problems here, to focus on little things and go, oh, this is the thing. This little thing is going to solve the problem. And it's almost very similar to what I was observing when I'm talking about that teacher whose classroom I went into, right? It's all fundamentally based on this notion that mathematics teaching is based on the delivery of information. And what Jessica's talking about here is like, sort of really, if you isolate neuroscience and say, well, what little neuroscience things can we use to facilitate this delivery of information to make it faster, better, quicker, or whatever, or so forth and so on, it's fundamentally still based on this flaw that math learning is just this delivery of information to the student. Nothing could be further from the truth. Mathematics learning happens when students are engaged, when they're puzzling things out, when they're thinking, when they're collaborating, when it gets messy, and all of those types of things. And what's interesting is that actually a lot of the neuroscience, cognitive science actually supports this. So my sort of bigger contention is that we don't actually implement hardly any of the proper science in a mathematics classroom setting. Still, I walk into way too many classrooms, especially once you get to middle and high school, and it's about a one-way flow of information with maybe a little bit of kind of interaction occurring. And if I look at most tech-based programs, it's basically a one-way flow of information with the student kind of maybe doing some stuff. And that, for me, is where the inherent problem lies. We still have this misvision of what mathematics learning really is. And when you've got that, we're just trying to layer, oh, this neuroscience thing will help, this thing will help. And it's like, no, it won't. Nothing's going to help if you don't fundamentally change what's at the heart, which is that math learning doesn't happen when you sit there and just sort of magically absorb it by sort of thing. You have to be an active participant. You have to figure stuff out. Once you start doing that, then I would argue that that's when the science actually starts to come alive. So for me, we need lots more of it. But I think I actually really agree with Jessica in terms of what that looks like. It's just that we need definitely a lot less of the little sound bites and a lot more of real genuine thinking about what does math instruction actually look like.
Okay, off to a good start here. I love, Nigel, what you're saying about like less of the sound bites. Like that's the goal of me having these long debates, right? It's a more thoughtful
Right.
conversation. I want adults to do that more. But my first question, and this is for both of you. So Jessica, you talked about you don't want to disregard science completely, but you want better science. And Nigel, you said the right science. So both of you just are not happy, it sounds like, with some of what's out there or some of what's pointed to a lot out there. And so I'm just wondering, how do teachers navigate and like how do they find what good science is, the right science? Like how do they make sure they're not relying on something that's not true? What advice do you have for us?
Part of the dilemma is that teachers are often pushed towards professional development that is sort of privileges neuroscience, right? And some of these ideas that when you're in a real classroom with real human beings, just are not working. So I think that teachers really need to trust their lived experience in the classroom, the way teachers always have, really, which is like, what is working for this particular student, or what is working for this particular cohort of kids as we're struggling through this concept, and then probably, take initiative on their own to sort of look into what strategies are out there that support their intuition about what their students need from them as the adult in the room who's guiding the lesson.
I mean, it's tricky, right? It's hard. This is not an easy thing to do. And I think the first thing I want to say here as well is, certainly from my perspective, teaching is an art form, not a science, right? Teaching well is unbelievably hard to do. It is not something that you can just sort of identikit, give somebody a little bit of training and have them go and do. It is a really difficult thing to do really well. And there are going to be tools that you use that are absolutely going to be based on all kinds of ideas, but science being one of them, neuroscience being one, cognitive science definitely being another. But the art of teaching, weaving all those things into a coherent whole, is very much focused on the students in front of you and how you use those tools to make that learning moment come alive. I think, how is there a magic litmus test that can easily be applied to anything? I don't know that there is. I would probably say that if it can fit in a Facebook post, it probably isn't that deep. You know what I mean? Like it's like reading a book is definitely probably a little bit more valuable than something that's sort of just, oh, this sounds like a great idea. And that isn't to invalidate all those things. Some things might be really useful, but fundamentally, the biggest shift is any idea, whether it's a neuroscience idea or cognitive science, emotional science, whatever it is that you want to try and do, is it throwing the focus of the effort in the classroom away from you and onto the students, right? Is it making the students have to do more thinking and do more work? That feels like a pretty good test. And if the answer is, yeah, if I do that, that's likely to end up with them doing more, good, fantastic, because that's the shift that needs to happen. When I was started teaching, especially here in the States, especially for the first few years, I did a lot of work and I loved doing it. But at the end of the day, the person that was learning the most in my classroom was me. And that's not the way to do it, right? The kids need to be learning the most. And that's going to happen from them doing the most. So whatever it is, if it's, I don't know, whatever it might be, but if it's something that's going to basically increase their desire to do more, their engagement to do more, or their ability to do more and get more involved, then it's probably going to be a good thing. Beyond that, it's hard to say. It's very difficult to sort of, necessarily give the litmus test to everything. But that would be one sort of measure of judgment I think might be worth using.
So when I think of like the typical teacher, starts the lesson with, here's the vocab, here's the formula we're doing, whatever, and then we do examples, things like that, like the typical math classroom you might picture. And I do a lot of visiting in classrooms and I see things like that. And Nigel, you talked about like the delivery of information is not great in math teaching. It's just doing that. So can you point us towards what ideas are working or not working in terms of the delivery of information? And this is for both of you. Like, maybe just like one piece of brain science research ideas that you believe in that is pointing us towards what we should be doing in the classroom when it comes to introducing vocab, giving notes, like all that kind of straightforward
I'll,
stuff?
I'll happily start with one, and I think it might strike a chord, so we'll see if that leads to something interesting. So let's say, for example, we're starting multiplication, right, in, say, third grade. There is such a tendency to, like you said, especially when starting new topics, to start with the vocabulary. I would say there is the first mistake. Right there, no. You want to start with visuals. You want to start with ideally manipulatives, things that kids can touch and play. So, for example, put 18 cubes on each desk and ask kids to figure out how many different ways they can group them into equal groups, right? They can do this with no vocabulary. They don't have to know any words to be able to do this. They can figure it out and go, oh, look, I can put it in groups of 3 and there's 6 of them, or I can make groups of 2 and there's 9 of them. They can do stuff that breaks this up. Now they are building schema, to use a little bit of neuroscience here, before any vocabulary is used to have, they don't need the term equal groups. You can just sort of go, break these into equal chunks or whatever the heck you want to call it. And start with activities that get the kids into the mathematical ideas before you start layering any kind of vocabulary or anything first. And it's inherently our brains, our spatial temporal devices, if you like. We have these incredible sort of puzzle pattern matching sort of things inside our heads. And mathematics, at the end of the day, is a spatial temporal activity. So if you can start with that visual, touching, moving things around, seeing how it works, if you can start with that, and then start adding vocabulary to describe the things that the kids now see, that is so much more powerful and a much more powerful way around rather than the typical way, like you said. Let's start with the vocabulary, a bunch of words that you don't know what the meaning is, and we're going to tell you what the meaning is. Hopefully that makes some sense. And then we go from there. You're layering layers of unmeaning on top of each other, right? And it's like if you can start with the visual, start with the mechanical, you can build meaning from the inside out. So that will be one sort of way that I would say is radically different from the way most people approach teaching math. And ideally, it wouldn't stop at third grade. There's no reason why you can't use manipulatives all the way through calculus, all the way through. Certainly, some of them might end up being virtual. It doesn't matter. There's all sorts of stuff you can do all the way up. Play with it first, basically, would be a simple way. How about a simple way of saying that? Get them to play with the mathematical idea first, then you can break it down and start doing the more sort of, symbolic stuff you need to do on top of that.
Yeah, and Jessica, maybe the opposite of that. So like something I think you both agree on is this idea of playing and exploring first. But so what are some things you're seeing in the brain science research that's out there that you don't agree with that are, cause you to write that article and making you question some of the things that people are promoting?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think about the students in my classroom who have this narrative of I'm bad at math, or and to me, that's a relational wound, right? That doesn't originate in the brain. There's nothing wrong with the processing that is happening in there, but it comes from an accumulation of experiences, right? Of being wrong in public, or a teacher being impatient, or a curriculum that's moving too quickly for them to sort of process and master. And that's actually one of the things actually that I think neuroscience is pointing us towards in a great way is how fundamental mastery of core skills is before moving kids on. And in the classroom, there's time pressure, right, to move through your curriculum. And so we end up not with a mastery-based education at all, but with kids who have like, Swiss cheese math at the end of the year where they've only mastered like 69% of the curriculum and yet we're moving them on. And so there's this narrative that forms. Um, so I think that, when what I notice a lot in my students is this desire to perform, that they think that they want to know, they want to get to the right answer because we're rewarding kids for the right answer, right, with a grade. And they can't. I loved when you talked about thinking, Nigel, and I'd love to dig into what does thinking look like in a math classroom a little bit, because what I'm finding is that I have students who are are mistaking computation with thinking, right? Mistaking the ability to compute with proficiency with solving a problem. And they don't have resilience or grit when it comes to struggle with a concept. And so to me, again, that's pointing not necessarily towards neuroscience, but towards something fundamental that's happening in the classroom where where neuroscience is being like privileged in the way that we are unrolling curriculum, and yet we have kids who can't think, and or who don't want to. And so that's very alarming to me as a teacher. Um, and everything that Nigel was talking about, again, I was so excited when I came across this 4E cognition, right? The mind, um, when we are thinking with our tools and our notebooks and our environments, like that is cognition that's very meaningful. That when we are interacting with each other, we're making meaning in a way that we can't when we're just solving problems
Mhm.
on paper. And that relational piece of it is something that we don't make time for. And it's where the real meaning making happens and where I think things will become more integrated for kids.
Oh boy. This this is beautiful. I want to take a step back a little bit because I know that like Nigel, when you talked about I think you said it without saying it, like language development, how language actually develops
Mm.
doesn't come from simply just like giving them kids definitions that they don't know
Yep.
in hopes that then they end up learning it. It's more integrated than that. It's more having conversations. But then I want to take it a step further because a lot of the pushback from brain-based research or math ed research is that math ed research or brain-based research doesn't match practice. What do we say to teachers? What do we say to educators that think that there is a disconnect, or maybe there is a disconnect, and if so, then why? Why is there a disconnect?
I would just ask, and I don't know enough about the background, but like research is often being conducted in a very controlled environment,
Mm.
under conditions that probably are not, and also, and again, I don't know this for sure, but so much of the research that we are, the curriculum that we're using now was probably pre-COVID, pre, um, devices and screens and attention
Mhm.
economy where kids so I'm wondering just like how up to date some of this research even is
Mhm.
that we're predicating our teaching on.
Mhm.
That's just one question like
Mhm.
that I have is like yeah, the teachers pushing back on the
Mhm.
researchers and
Yeah.
saying it's
Well,
just
and maybe even pre-thinking also, Jess, like as Nigel was saying. And Nigel, let me guide it a little bit deeper. Okay.
Mhm.
There are websites out there that are promoting what works in a very controlled environment, what
Sure.
Jess said. But when we take it to the masses, it doesn't always work. So how do we distinguish between what works and what doesn't, and what part of neuroscience should we use? And are there other parts that maybe work in certain areas and not?
Yeah. So this is a very a slightly different discussion, a good discussion, and this is about educational research in general, not so much neuroscience research, but
Right.
educational research. Unfortunately, when you unpack a lot of studies, they are not done at a large enough scale to be meaningful implemented at scale, right? Like, so for example, if you have published on one of those websites a study which has 19,000 students in the study, but only 200 of those students completed enough of the program to actually be considered to be part of the data set, I don't think that's meaningful, but that's up there, right? So there are a lot of problems with the stuff that's on those websites, and yes, you might want to cut this bit out. I don't know, but this is a different thing to neuroscience research, right? This is education research and very much program-oriented education research. And I would say that the answer to that is there should never just be one study. If you can't, I mean, they might not all be on that website, but if you dig deeper and you can only find two or three studies and they're relatively limited in scope, that's not really going to support a large implementation. If you can find 50 studies or studies across hundreds of schools or large thousands and thousands of students, then that's interesting, right? And they do exist, but that's different from that's those are more program studies. And again, implementation is a massive challenge in any implementation of any program. So it's a slightly different thing from, you know, sort of the neuroscience, cognitive science research being applied to education in general. But
Mhm.
the thing I was going to say about that was that again, so often what gets presented to teachers is some idea that just feels like one more thing, right? It's like, oh, here's this one more thing that you now need to try and do in your classroom. that isn't going to help anybody. And again, if it's not part of a coordinated plan and a coordinated approach, whether it be through a program, not with a program, but part of some kind of coordinated plan of changing teaching across, a district or something, it's probably not going to have a heck of a lot of an effect. So, and I think too often a lot of these things are rolled out as here's this new thing you need to try doing, and it just feels like one more thing. And yeah, from a teacher's point of view, that just gets overwhelming. Cognitive load is not only a thing that affects students, right? Cognitive load is basically when you're so overloaded with trying to figure out what's happening, you can't even get to think about the problem at hand, which happens in math class to students a lot of the time because of language and symbols. But for teachers, cognitive load is the load of, okay, I've got all this stuff I have to do. Oh, and then I've got to teach. And we just need to make sure we're very careful that we're not overloading teachers with stuff just gets in the way of them actually teaching, right? But at the same time, we can't just keep teaching the way we've been doing just because it feels good. There are definitely things that can be changed that can have a big impact. So it's it's a delicate balance. There's a lot there.
Mhm. Well, that's a really important thing that you just said, Nigel, about especially about the difference between the neuroscience and the math ed research. I think
Hmm.
that's a misconception that people have, especially as we're diving into this. And so, I guess to kind of lean into that misconception, oftentimes teachers are sitting in these professional developments, and then they're hearing, neuroscience informed practices being emphasized. How could they respond? How should they respond? And then the people who are delivering that, how can we make it not feel like one more thing? And Jess, from either standpoint.
I thought about this in advance, so I have like notes. I'm just going to read some things because I think that actually it's helpful, right? So, as I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, neuroscience belongs when we're talking about conditions and mechanisms, right? So, like some questions that I think neuroscience has been very helpful in addressing are like, how does memory consolidate, right? Neuroscience has earned its place with spaced practice and retrieval and interleaving. Or what does chronic stress do to learning, right? So when we're saying, well, how is stress impairing executive functioning and how can we help to support students? Or what role does sleep play in learning, right? I know at our school a couple years ago, we redid our schedule because we were like, well, not all students are morning people. So perhaps by moving math class to the afternoons a couple times a week, then those students who are more awake in the afternoons will perform better, right? Like those were really interesting things. But I think that anytime we're talking about meaning or identity or relation, those are not things that show up necessarily on fMRIs during these studies, right? So, and I think that sometimes it's presented to teachers as a neuroscience issue or a brain issue. So, for instance, the question of like, why is the student disengaged right now, right? Over reliance on neuroscience might say, well, they've got depleted executive functioning and you need to give them a brain break. When really, maybe what you should be doing is saying, are they disengaging because they're having an issue with belonging or meaning here? Do they not see themselves in whatever it is that we're doing? And this is particularly true, I think, in diverse communities where different cultures have different experiences or even different mathematical systems that show up in their households, right? Or how do I address math anxiety? Oh, well, reduce working memory load and use low stakes retrieval to desensitize when really you could be saying, like, what experiences has this kid had prior to coming to my classroom that are making them feel so worried? And how can I make the environment feel safer? Right. So I feel like sometimes what's happening is that we are being given neuroscientific strategies to address what are really fundamentally relational issues in the classroom. And that's where I think teachers actually could sort of say, is this addressing mechanism? Because if so, like the brain is very mechanistic and this makes sense. But is this actually a question where if I were to sit down with my student and sort of have a conversation with them or try to ask, like, what is this behavior or what is this communicating about the student's sense of belonging or purpose or meaning, even though those are sort of campy ideas and feel like sometimes they don't have a place anymore at school. Like that when we talk about meaning and identity belonging, it becomes so unscientific. And that's why teachers are so afraid of it because they don't want to be accused, I think, of like not being rigorous in their approach to teaching and learning. And somehow relationship, it feels not rigorous
Mm.
when compared to neuroscience. So that's where, bringing in the cognitive science that points to relationship and the inactive mind as being so essential to cognition, bringing that back. I think bring back relationship and meaning, and don't make it so much about mechanistic stuff. I don't know.
Nigel, you
I'm
want to
not as
add?
articulate as Nigel, but
No, 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 that's great. I think there's actually something very interesting there because I think while on the one hand there is a place to say, well, this is neuroscience, this is cognitive science, when it comes to learning, for me, I don't know that you can separate those two things out, right? They're so interwoven. So, for example, there is a lot of research showing that kids perform vastly better if they like their teacher, especially at a young age. Like, I mean, just as simple as that. When they go to school, do they like their teacher? Yes, they perform better. So, I mean, and there's tons of research on that. So it's already out there. And that speaks hugely to what you're talking about, Jessica, this notion that the relationship part of the classroom teacher is a massively important part of the role. And I would hate for people to be feeling that somehow that wasn't important, right? Because that is, you could almost argue, especially for younger children, that's probably the most important thing that's happening in the classroom is in the first few years of their school. If they like the person that they're spending most of their day with, they will have a much better school experience from that point on than almost anything else you could do. So that, yeah, we definitely do not want teachers to be feeling that somehow that part of being a teacher is less important than whatever other brain-based, so let's call it ideology, might be the flavor of the month. Because at the end of the day, that is a huge thing. I'll give a small example. My son, who's now ninth grade, had a teacher in first grade who was, it was not so great. And he made it through okay, but it was a challenge. And my daughter, then being even younger, she was in kindergarten when COVID happened and basically did most of kinder and some of first grade on Zoom. And that was not a good experience. She was well behind in reading, and a lot of that was very much just she just didn't have the typical social experience of being in a classroom with kids and playing and doing all that stuff. So the the social emotional, the cognitive science part of that is hugely important. But I do think where neuroscience does have something that should be inserted into the math teaching conversation and isn't anywhere near enough, does have a part to play in then students' math anxiety, students' relationships with math, because far too often, if students had, like I said, a chance to play with math before being taught all this stuff, that also would dramatically change their relationship with how they feel about mathematics. So the actual content, the way that that content is delivered, which neuroscience would say, don't do it by telling, right? It would say, start with visuals, start with spatial temporal opportunities for kids to make sense of things first themselves. That unfortunately that doesn't play as much of a role as it should, but that could actually have a big impact on kids' relationship with mathematics, even though it's not necessarily about their holistic being per se, but it is about the way of teaching, but it could have a big impact, I think. So bit of a messy answer, bit of this, bit of that, but hopefully there's something there that's useful.
Yeah, I have just one last question. I'm thinking about someone who may want to push back on what you're all saying, right? And they're like, this all sounds really touchy-feely, emotional, wishy-washy. And the way it's been going in school, it worked for me. And I see many teachers like that. They're like, it worked for me. Just tell me the information. I'll crank it out. I'll be good. I'll get an A, right? It worked for me. What do you say to teachers and other and parents and other adults who say like, well, the way it has been, it worked for me, and I see research out there that supports that. So why should I listen to you?
So I actually have an answer for this, Jessica. You can absolutely have the last word and wrap this up. I'll just go because I literally had to deal with this. So COVID happened. My son was in third grade at the time. We did an after school pod thing with some, friends of ours and their kids. So all the kids together. And the parents got to see the math the kids were doing in third grade a lot more closely than they ever had before, right? And they're looking at these area models and they're thinking about the way that they learned math and they're looking at these things. And every single parent, whether they were from Tibet, Armenia, or Glendale in California, they all said the same thing. They said, why are we not teaching math the way we used to? Right? They all asked me this question because they knew I did something vaguely with math, but they couldn't quite name it. But so I had to really figure out an answer to this. And there is an answer, and it's a good answer as well, right? So the year of my birth, 1969, we did something that we're actually doing today. We went to the moon, right? And to get us to the moon, there were rooms full of people who basically were human computers who basically helped us to get to the moon. My mother was not a human computer, but she absolutely used arithmetic, mathematics on a daily basis as what was called back then a secretary, office manager, probably be called today, right? And it was useful for people at that time, not that long ago, so within my lifetime, it was incredibly a useful skill to just be able to crank out being able to be good and proficient at mathematical procedures. Like literally, if you came out of school being proficient at just doing mathematical procedures, that was good. And NASA even wrote a memo in 1942 saying basically, we need loads of people coming out of the school system who need to be able to crank out all this stuff. We don't care if they understand how it works, right? So they said to the school system, produce lots of people out of your math classrooms. We only need a few that really understand it. Most of them, they just need to be able to do it, and that's great. The number of people that are employed today to be good at doing procedural mathematics is zero. Not one person is employed. Anybody who uses any kind of mathematical thinking today, it's pattern thinking, figuring out how something applies to something. You're basically having to think creatively with mathematics. So if we're still teaching our kids and thinking that, great, they're coming out of school and they can crank out these procedures, and I taught them how to add fractions using a butterfly method. That was great. They can do that. Totally useless. Utterly useless. There is no point to just being able to do these things. If you're not understanding how it works, if you're not involved in figuring out the patterns, struggling, persevering, being challenged to think. And we didn't talk enough about this because Jessica hinted about it. It's such a great thing. It's like, what does thinking look like in a math classroom? It looks like going wrong. It looks like struggling. It looks messy. It looks like, I don't get this. Frustration, even. It's allowed. It's not a crime to be frustrated in the math classroom if you have a teacher who can skillfully guide the class to a good conclusion in that thing, right? Um, but that's the value in teaching math today is we have to have kids coming out who are able to think and not afraid to be wrong and not afraid to go, well, I don't know what to do here. I'm going to figure it out. And unfortunately, if we stick within this rigid box, the way that we teach and the way that, we're sort of going, oh, great, neuroscience says if we do this, we'll get them to the result faster. Doesn't matter. It's all based on this premise of like, if we just tell, then that's going to be useful. It's not useful. There's no point anymore to coming out of a classroom just being able to do some mathematics. You have to be able to think creatively. So anyway, just wanted to, and I think hopefully the parents sort of understood that. I still think there was a lot of like, I just want to teach them the way I did it. But I think they began to see that, okay, yeah, right, there might be something to this. So.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also, speaking from personal experience, the people who are saying that are likely people who were good at math when they were younger and that worked for them. As somebody who struggled with math, what I would say is that teaching math today, the way that we do now. I mean, Nigel referenced the area model, and when we were just working on multiplication and division using partial products and partial quotients. Super new. Like parents do not like that. And I understood math for the first time
Mm.
when I started to see the problems broken down in that way. Like I was like, oh, that's why you carry a
Yep.
one, or when,
Yeah.
or like regrouping, right? When I was subtracting when I was younger, it was just like, this is what you do, and I didn't understand it. So I could do it in the moment, but like when I came across a novel situation where I had to apply the concept, but not like it didn't look like the problem that I had been doing. I didn't understand how to do the math. And so when I think about like self-determination theory and the importance of competence and autonomy, and I think about myself as a math thinker now, feeling so much more competent and confident having learned all of these different strategies that we teach kids today. I'm like, okay, there is a population of people who really do require this. They don't like it though. I mean, like when you were talking about the struggle and the grades and the getting things wrong. I mean, sorry, you didn't mention grades. That's part of the problem, like it is not safe to struggle in a classroom where you are going to have a grade on your transcript at the end. Kids want to know what is the fastest way for me
Hmm.
to get from here to an A. Like just teach me the thing I need to do so that I can do well. Like so I do think that the struggle and when we think about math, it's again, it's not just procedural. It's all about the type of communication you're doing, the type of collaboration you're doing, the type of meaning making that you're doing. And the world that our children are inheriting is not the same as the world that we are currently living in. I mean, I have children who are getting ready to go to college, and I'm sort of like I can't even imagine what the world is going to look like next year. It's hard to know how to guide them. And I think that AI is a whole other question that could come into this conversation where it's going to be doing a lot of the procedural stuff that we spend so much time on in the math classroom. So, teaching math in a machine age is a really interesting debate to have, but our parents and even us are not inheriting the world that our children are. And I do think that um, the brain-based, including cognitive science, like again, I want to lean into all of that and say that it's important, but I think that the meaning making and everything that comes out of learning how to think about math is going to be what allows our kids to adapt to the world that they are going to inherit.
Okay, and that concludes our questioning round.
Hi, listeners. Before we get into final arguments, we want to pause and have you ponder for a moment. What did the guest just say? And what stood out for you?
Whatever is on your mind, we want to hear it.
Did you know you can text us your thoughts?
Just head to the show notes for this episode and look for the Text Us link. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
And with that, let's hear our closing statements.
We'll now end by giving our speakers a minute or two to make their final arguments to you.
And we're going to begin first with Jess. Grab
Thanks.
Jessica.
I think that what I would like to do is just to address all of the teachers who are listening to the podcast and to say that teaching math, teaching anything these days is very challenging. It's very complex. And the more you can get out there and understand the why behind the strategies that you're trying to implement in your classroom, the more prepared you'll be to sort of support the students, but also, and again, I'm speaking from lived experience, knowing who your students are is the most important thing. So, whatever neuroscience tells us, whatever anything is telling us, when we have a child in front of us, they are the expert in their own thinking and their own way of being. And so, centering the child and children in your classroom, if you make that your priority, you'll always be successful, I think. If you stop and say, who am I teaching? That's the most important question that you can be asking at any time.
Beautiful. And with the final word, Nigel.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to start with the the most fun I get to have these days, and I still get to do this quite a bit, is I get to go into classrooms and actually try things. And every time I do this, and get a chance to go into classrooms about as low as second grade in terms of age through to sort of middle and high school. Every time I do this, I'm trying some different type of activity or something that I might be working on. Kids always surprise me. They always, when given the opportunity to bring their thinking, they bring it in ways that you do not expect them to do. And for me, one of the real challenges of teaching is learning how to get out of the way as much as possible, right? Where you're providing them with an environment where they feel keen and excited to explore something. You're providing them with the tools because you know that it'll help to guide them on a path of discovery. And when you do that, kids bring thinking that is remarkable. And the big push for me is how do we help teachers transition away from telling towards actually sort of creating that environment and creating an opportunity for the kids to really do as much of the thinking as possible. Because as we were discussing, it is so critical today that kids come out of the classroom being creative mathematical thinkers, right? We can no longer think of mathematics as this static subject, which is just a bunch of things to learn. It is a way of thinking and analyzing the world that you can use in an incredibly creative way if you learn it through a creative way. And there's just such a shift that I think neuroscience can actually play a big part in helping to understand what that shift looks like. We just need to be really careful that anyone who writes an article saying 3 neuro tricks for your classroom is probably not all about that shift, right? Even though I'm sure I've probably written that article myself at some point. Like, we got to go deeper. And I think the challenge is making sure that we do stay focused on that bigger picture and not getting wrapped up in these little side tracks, which just become one more thing and become overwhelming and don't actually help. So I think there is a huge push to be had here. And for kids, it's critical that we make that. But we just got to really kind of go, yeah, education needs to move, math education needs to move massively to keep up with what's happening. And it's going to take a village. It's going to take everybody: neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, educators, behavioral therapists, all together, kind of figuring out how to make this thing move forward. And then perhaps we can do something really special.
Wonderful. And thank you both. That concludes this discussion.
Now it's up to our listeners to take a moment, ponder the arguments, and share with friends. What resonated with you. Be sure to follow us on Blue Sky at Debate Math to share your thoughts on this debate.
Again, huge thanks to both of you for joining us as guests with, somewhat of a controversial opinion and bringing it forward with such thoughtfulness and great ideas.
And thanks to all those who are listening. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this.
So as we wrap up, Jessica, where can listeners find you, get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think anyone who wants to talk more about this or learn more, especially about the 4E cognition, which is something I'm very passionate about myself, the best place to reach me would probably be at my personal email, which is signal@jessicasolomon.co.
And Nigel, where can listeners find you?
Sure. So stmath.com is always a good place to start because that's the program which I've been now part of designing for the last 15 years. But I also have a blog where I kind of actually put stuff and engage with discussions with people, which is Visual First Math, and that's on Substack. So very happy to have conversations with people there as well. I enjoy when people actually comment on stuff and we get into some really good discussions. So Visual First Math or STMath, either one.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Want to learn more about incorporating debate activities into your math classroom? Go to luzniak.com/podcast to sign up for my mailing list, learn more about debate math, and connect with resources you could use in your classroom today. That's luzniak.com/podcast.
Feel free to reach out to us with comments and questions on debatemath.com, or follow us on social media at debatemath or at debatemathpod on Twitter.
And don't forget that you can text us with your thoughts on any of the debates too.
You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts.
or wherever you listen to this podcast. Your feedback is super important to us. Well, that's all from us.
Looking forward to debating with you next episode. Until next time, cheers.